The tension in the White House had been building for weeks. Donald Trump paced back and forth in the Oval Office, his face red with frustration. J.D. Vance sat across from him, his jaw clenched tight as he listened to another one of Trump's rants about the media coverage. "They're making us look like fools, J.D.," Trump shouted, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "Every single day it's something new. They twist our words, they make up stories, and you just sit there doing nothing about it." Vance had heard this complaint 100 times before, but today felt different. The pressure from Congress, the constant criticism from the press, and now Trump's endless blame game had pushed him to his breaking point. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly. "Maybe the problem isn't the media, Donald," Vance said, his voice steady but cold. "Maybe the problem is that we keep giving them reasons to write these stories." The room fell silent. Trump's eyes widened with shock. In all their years of working together, Vance had never spoken to him like this. The two men stared at each other across the room, the air thick with unspoken anger. Outside the Oval Office, the Secret Service agents could hear the voices getting louder. Agent Sarah Martinez, a 10-year veteran of the presidential detail, exchanged worried glances with her partner. They had witnessed many heated discussions between political figures, but this felt different. This felt personal. Trump's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Excuse me? Are you seriously blaming me for the fake news media's lies?" "I'm saying we need to take responsibility for our actions," Vance replied, stepping closer to the desk. "Every tweet, every public statement, every decision we make has consequences. And right now, those consequences are destroying our credibility." The argument continued to escalate. Trump began listing all the ways he felt Vance had failed him as vice president. Vance fired back with his own list of grievances, including times when Trump had made decisions without consulting him or the cabinet. "You promised we'd work as a team," Vance said, his voice rising. "But you treat me like I'm just another yes man." "Well, I'm not going to stand here and nod while you drive this administration into the ground." Trump pointed an accusing finger at Vance. "I made you vice president. Without me, you'd still be writing books that nobody reads. And without me, you'd have lost the election." Vance shot back. The shouting match had reached a level that even the thick walls of the Oval Office couldn't contain. Staff members in the hallway stopped their work, unable to ignore the commotion coming from the most powerful office in America. Agent Martinez pressed her earpiece, quietly alerting the rest of the security team about the situation. Protocol required them to monitor any potential threats to the president's safety, even if those threats came from within his own administration. Inside the office, Trump grabbed a stack of papers from his desk and threw them in Vance's direction. The documents scattered across the floor like confetti. "I don't need this from you, J.D. I don't need this from anyone." Vance bent down and picked up one of the papers. It was a briefing document about upcoming congressional hearings. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Trump with a mixture of disappointment and anger. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Vance said, holding up the paper. "These hearings are important. They affect real people's lives. But all you care about is how they make you look on television." The argument had moved beyond policy disagreements. It had become personal, with both men saying things they had probably thought for months but never dared to voice. The partnership that had won them the White House was crumbling before their eyes. Trump walked to the window, looking out at the rose garden. For a moment the shouting stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. When he turned back around, his expression had changed from anger to something colder. "Maybe it's time we reconsidered our working relationship," Trump said quietly. Vance straightened his tie and looked directly at the president. "Maybe it is." The two men stood in the aftermath of their explosive confrontation, both realizing that their partnership might have just reached its breaking point. Neither of them knew that their argument was about to become very public, and that a member of the Royal Guard would soon share something that would shock the entire nation. The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had exploded in the Oval Office. Trump arrived at work earlier than usual, his mood even darker than the previous day. He had spent most of the night awake, replaying the argument with Vance and becoming more convinced that his vice president was working against him. Vance, meanwhile, had also struggled to sleep. He sat in his home office until dawn, drafting and redrafting a resignation letter that he wasn't sure he had the courage to submit. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. When they crossed paths in the hallway outside the cabinet room, both men pretended the other didn't exist. Staff members noticed the icy atmosphere immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when either Trump or Vance entered a room. The entire West Wing felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Chief of Staff Rebecca Walsh tried to mediate between the two men, scheduling separate meetings with each of them. She had served in previous administrations and had seen political partnerships fail before, but never at this level and never this publicly. "Mr. President," she said carefully during their meeting, "the staff is starting to notice the tension. Maybe it would be good to have a conversation with the Vice President about moving forward." Trump leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. JD made his position very clear yesterday. "He thinks I'm the problem." Well, if that's how he feels, maybe he should find somewhere else to work. Meanwhile, in his own office, Vance was having a similar conversation with his chief of staff. "I've tried to be loyal," Vance explained. "I've defended decisions I didn't agree with. I've stood by him through every controversy. But yesterday showed me that he doesn't respect me or the office I hold." The breaking point came during the weekly cabinet meeting. Both men sat at the large conference table, surrounded by department heads and senior advisors. The agenda focused on economic policy, but everyone in the room could feel the tension between the president and vice president. When Treasury Secretary James Morgan raised concerns about proposed tax changes, Trump immediately looked to Vance for support. "The vice president agrees with me on this, don't you, JD?" Vance looked around the table at the faces watching him. For months, he had automatically agreed with Trump's positions, even when he privately disagreed. But not today. "Actually, Mr. President, I think Secretary Morgan raises valid concerns that we should address," Vance said clearly. The room fell silent. Cabinet members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Trump's face began to redden, the same way it had the day before. "I see," Trump said slowly. "So now you're contradicting me in front of the entire cabinet?" "I'm expressing my honest opinion about policy," Vance replied. "Isn't that what you want from your team?" Trump stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What I want is loyalty. What I want is a vice president who supports his president instead of undermining him." Vance also stood, facing Trump across the table. "Loyalty doesn't mean blind agreement. It means telling you the truth, even when you don't want to hear it." The other cabinet members watched in shock as the two highest-ranking officials in the government faced off. Some looked down at their papers, trying to avoid being drawn into the confrontation. Others stared openly, unable to believe what they were witnessing. "Maybe you forgot who's president here," Trump said, his voice rising. "I haven't forgotten anything," Vance replied. "Have you forgotten that we're supposed to be working together for the American people?" The argument escalated quickly. Trump accused Vance of being disloyal and ungrateful. Vance accused Trump of being unwilling to listen to anyone who disagreed with him. The professional facade that both men had maintained in public settings completely crumbled. Secretary of Defense Patricia Collins finally stood up. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," she suggested diplomatically. But it was too late. The damage was done. Everyone in the room had witnessed the complete breakdown of the Trump-Vance partnership. Word would spread throughout the administration within hours. Trump stormed out of the cabinet room without another word. Vance remained standing for a moment, looking at the shocked faces around the table. He realized that there was no going back from this moment. "I apologize for that display," Vance said to the cabinet members. "Let's reschedule this meeting for tomorrow." As the cabinet members filed out, whispering among themselves, Vance knew that his time as vice president was probably coming to an end. What he didn't know was that someone outside the administration had been watching very carefully and was about to share information that would change everything. The Royal Guard, an elite security unit that had been quietly observing both men for weeks, had seen enough. Their duty went beyond protecting individuals. It extended to protecting the stability of the government itself, and what they had witnessed convinced them that the American people needed to know the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. Captain Michael Harrison of the Royal Guard had served his country for 15 years. He had protected presidents, foreign dignitaries, and witnessed some of the most sensitive moments in American politics. But nothing had prepared him for what he had been observing over the past several weeks. The Royal Guard was a special unit, different from the Secret Service. While the Secret Service protected the physical safety of the president and vice president, the Royal Guard's mission was broader. They monitored threats to the stability of the government itself. They were the watchers who watched the watchers, reporting directly to a classified oversight committee. Harrison sat in his secure office, reviewing the detailed reports his team had compiled. Agent Lisa Chen, his most trusted operative, had been positioned close to both Trump and Vance during their recent confrontations. Her reports painted a disturbing picture of two leaders whose personal conflict was threatening the functioning of the entire executive branch. "Captain," Agent Chen said as she entered his office, "I've finished the analysis of yesterday's cabinet meeting. The breakdown was even worse than we initially thought." She handed him a thick file containing transcripts, behavioral analysis, and security assessments. Harrison read through the documents with growing concern. The Royal Guard had protocols for many situations, but a complete collapse of trust between the president and vice president was unprecedented. "What's your recommendation?" Harrison asked. Agent Chen had been dreading this question. In all her years of service, she had never been in a position where she felt the need to go public with classified observations. But the situation had reached a critical point. "Sir, I believe the American people have a right to know what's happening. This isn't just a personal disagreement anymore. It's affecting national security, policy decisions, and the basic functioning of government." Harrison nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it from his most experienced agent confirmed his instincts. The Royal Guard had access to information that would shock the public. They had recorded conversations, documented erratic behavior, and witnessed moments that revealed the true extent of the dysfunction at the highest levels of government. The decision to go public was not made lightly. Harrison spent hours consulting with legal experts, reviewing protocols and considering the consequences. The Royal Guard operated under special authority that allowed them to act in the national interest, even if it meant revealing classified information. "We'll need to be strategic about this," Harrison told his team during an emergency meeting. "We can't just dump everything at once. We need to present the information in a way that serves the public interest without compromising ongoing security operations." Agent Chen had already been thinking about this. "I've been in contact with Margaret Stevens from Channel 7 News. She's been investigating rumors about tensions in the White House. She might be willing to give us a platform to share what we know." Margaret Stevens was known for her integrity and her ability to handle sensitive political stories. She had covered the White House for over a decade and had built a reputation for fair and accurate reporting. More importantly, she had the reach and credibility to ensure that the Royal Guard's revelations would be taken seriously. Harrison made the call that afternoon. "Mrs. Stevens, this is Captain Michael Harrison of the Royal Guard. I have information about the current situation between President Trump and Vice President Vance that I believe the American people need to hear." Stevens was initially skeptical. The Royal Guard rarely made contact with journalists, and their existence was not widely known outside of security circles. But as Harrison began to describe what his team had observed, she realized she was being offered unprecedented access to one of the biggest political stories in years. "Captain, are you prepared to go on record with this information?" Stevens asked. "I am," Harrison replied. "But I want to do it live, so there's no question about the authenticity of what I'm sharing. The American people deserve to hear the truth directly from someone who was there." They arranged for a live television interview the following evening. Stevens would have the exclusive, but she agreed to Harrison's condition that he would control the narrative and decide what information to reveal. Harrison spent the next day preparing for what would be the most important interview of his career. He reviewed his notes, consulted with legal advisors, and made peace with the fact that his decision would probably end his career in government service. But as he thought about the oath he had taken to protect and defend the Constitution, Harrison knew he was making the right choice. The dysfunction he had witnessed between Trump and Vance was threatening the very foundations of democratic government. Someone needed to speak up, and the Royal Guard was uniquely positioned to provide the truth. The night before the interview, Harrison received a secure message from Agent Chen. "Captain, we've just intercepted communications suggesting that both Trump and Vance are planning separate press conferences tomorrow. They may be preparing to make this conflict even more public." Harrison realized that his interview was about to become even more significant. He wouldn't just be revealing what had happened. He would be providing context for whatever Trump and Vance were about to tell the American people. The Royal Guard's perspective could help the public understand the real truth behind the political theater they were about to witness. As he prepared for bed, Harrison thought about the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would share information that could change the course of American politics. The question was whether the country was ready to hear the truth about what was really happening behind the scenes. The Channel 7 news studio was unusually busy for a Thursday evening. Word had leaked that Margaret Stevens was conducting a special live interview with a high-ranking government official, though the identity of her guest remained secret until minutes before airtime. Captain Michael Harrison sat in the makeup chair, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. He had chosen to wear a simple dark suit rather than his uniform, wanting to appear as a concerned citizen rather than a government operative. His hands were steady, but his mind raced through the implications of what he was about to do. 30 seconds to air, the floor director announced. Stevens reviewed her notes one final time. She had spent hours preparing questions that would draw out the most important information without compromising national security. This was the kind of interview that could define a journalist's career. "Good evening, I'm Margaret Stevens," she began, as the red light on the camera illuminated. "Tonight we have an exclusive interview with Captain Michael Harrison of the Royal Guard, a classified security unit that monitors threats to governmental stability. Captain Harrison, thank you for joining us." Harrison looked directly into the camera. "Thank you, Margaret. I want to be clear that I'm here tonight because I believe the American people have a right to know what's happening in their government." "Let's start with the basics," Stevens said. "What exactly is the Royal Guard and what have you been observing?" "The Royal Guard is a special unit tasked with monitoring threats to the continuity of government," Harrison explained. "We operate independently of the Secret Service and report directly to a classified oversight committee. Over the past month, my team has observed a complete breakdown in the working relationship between President Trump and Vice President Vance." Stevens leaned forward. "Can you be more specific about what you've witnessed?" Harrison took a deep breath. This was the moment of no return. "We have documented multiple instances of heated arguments, public disagreements, and what can only be described as open hostility between the two highest-ranking officials in our government." "Are you talking about policy disagreements or something more personal?" "Both," Harrison replied. "What started as disagreements about policy and media strategy has evolved into personal attacks and mutual accusations of disloyalty. We have recordings of conversations where both men have questioned each other's fitness for office. The revelation sent shockwaves through social media. Within minutes, the Royal Guard reveals was trending on Twitter. News organizations across the country began interrupting their regular programming to cover the breaking story." Stevens pressed for more details. "Captain, you mentioned recordings. What exactly have you heard?" Harrison had prepared for this question. "I can share some examples that don't compromise ongoing security operations." During their argument in the Oval Office 3 days ago, President Trump accused Vice President Vance of being disloyal and ungrateful. Vice President Vance responded by saying that the president was driving the administration into the ground. These are direct quotes. "These are direct quotes from our surveillance recordings," Harrison confirmed. In the White House, both Trump and Vance were watching the interview with growing alarm. Neither of them had known about the Royal Guard's surveillance capabilities. Trump immediately called his chief of staff, demanding to know how this was possible. "Sir, the Royal Guard operates under special authority that predates most modern administrations," Chief of Staff Walsh explained. "They have broad powers to monitor threats to governmental stability." Vance was having a similar conversation with his own staff. "How long have they been recording our private conversations?" he demanded. Back in the studio, Stevens continued her questioning. "Captain Harrison, what concerns you most about what you've observed?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "My primary concern is that this personal conflict is affecting policy decisions and compromising the government's ability to function effectively. We've witnessed instances where important national security briefings were delayed or canceled because the president and vice president couldn't be in the same room together. Can you give us a specific example?" "Last Tuesday, a briefing about threats in the South China Sea was postponed for 6 hours because President Trump refused to attend if Vice President Vance was present. During that delay, our allies in the region were left without crucial information about our response strategy." The revelation about national security implications made the story even more significant. Stevens knew she was witnessing history being made in real time. "Captain, why are you choosing to reveal this information now?" Harrison looked directly into the camera again. "Because I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. The dysfunction I've witnessed threatens the very foundations of our democratic system. The American people elected both of these men to work together for the good of the country. Instead, they're engaged in a personal feud that's paralyzing the executive branch. What do you think should happen next?" "That's not for me to decide," Harrison replied. "But I believe the American people deserve to know the truth, so they can make informed decisions about their government." As the interview continued, Harrison revealed more details about the extent of the conflict. He described how staff members were being forced to choose sides, how policy meetings had become shouting matches, and how the basic functions of government were being compromised by personal animosity. The interview lasted 30 minutes, but its impact would be felt for much longer. By the time it ended, news organizations around the world were covering the story. Congressional leaders were calling for investigations, and both Trump and Vance were preparing their own responses to what Captain Harrison had revealed. As Harrison left the studio, he knew his life would never be the same. He had broken decades of protocol and risked his career to tell the truth. But as he walked into the Washington night, he felt a sense of relief. The American people finally knew what was really happening behind the closed doors of their government. Within hours of Captain Harrison's television interview, Washington was in complete chaos. The phones at the White House rang nonstop as reporters, congressional leaders, and foreign diplomats demanded explanations. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to outrage to calls for immediate action. President Trump was the first to respond publicly. At 11:30 p.m., just 2 hours after the interview ended, he posted a series of messages on social media that only made the situation worse. "The so-called Royal Guard captain is a disgraced operative who has been looking for attention for years," Trump wrote. "His claims are completely false and probably illegal. I'm ordering a full investigation into this breach of security protocols." But Trump's response backfired spectacularly. Instead of denying the specific claims about his arguments with Vance, he had focused on attacking the messenger. Political analysts immediately pointed out that Trump hadn't actually disputed any of the facts Harrison had revealed. Vance, meanwhile, remained silent for several hours. His staff worked frantically to craft a response that would distance him from Trump without appearing disloyal to the administration. When his statement finally came at 2 a.m., it was carefully worded but revealed more than intended. "While I cannot comment on the specific methods used by intelligence agencies, I want to assure the American people that I remain committed to serving this administration and this country with honor and integrity." Vance's statement read, political experts immediately noticed what Vance hadn't said. He hadn't denied having the arguments with Trump. He hadn't expressed confidence in their working relationship. And he hadn't defended the president against Harrison's accusations. By morning, congressional leaders from both parties were demanding answers. House Speaker Maria Rodriguez called for immediate hearings. "The American people deserve to know if their government is functioning effectively," she said at a hastily arranged press conference. Senate Majority Leader David Kim went even further. "If these allegations are true, we're facing a constitutional crisis. We need a full investigation into the claims made by Captain Harrison, and we need it now." The international reaction was equally swift and concerning. European allies privately expressed worry about America's stability. Stock markets opened lower, as investors worried about political uncertainty. The Chinese government issued a statement saying they were monitoring the situation with interest. Back at the White House, Chief of Staff Rebecca Walsh found herself in an impossible position. She needed to manage two principals who could barely stand to be in the same building, while also dealing with the media frenzy and congressional pressure. "We need to present a united front," she told both Trump and Vance during separate emergency meetings. "The country is watching, and our enemies are watching even more closely." But unity seemed impossible. Trump was furious about what he saw as a betrayal by the Royal Guard and was demanding the immediate firing of anyone connected to the surveillance operation. Vance, meanwhile, was quietly consulting with legal advisors about his options, including the possibility of resignation. The situation became even more complicated when additional Royal Guard agents began speaking out. Agent Lisa Chen, Harrison's second-in-command, confirmed many of his claims in an interview with a different news network. "Captain Harrison was absolutely right to go public," Chen said. "The dysfunction we observed was unlike anything in our operational history. We documented over 30 instances of serious conflict between the president and vice president in just the past month." Her interview included new details that Harrison hadn't shared. She revealed that Secret Service agents had been placed on alert during some of the arguments, worried that the shouting might escalate into physical confrontation. She also confirmed that several cabinet members had privately expressed concerns about the president and vice president's ability to work together. The revelations sent shockwaves through Congress. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Homeland Security Committee, announced that she would be calling Harrison and other Royal Guard operatives to testify under oath. "We need to determine if these allegations represent a threat to national security," Williams said. "If the president and vice president cannot work together effectively, it affects everything from military readiness to diplomatic relations." Meanwhile, former government officials began speaking out about the implications of the revelations. Former Secretary of State Robert Martinez appeared on multiple news programs, warning about the damage being done to America's international standing. "When our closest allies start questioning whether our government can function effectively, it undermines every aspect of our foreign policy," Martinez explained. "This isn't just about domestic politics anymore. It's about America's credibility on the world stage." The pressure continued to build throughout the week. Polling data showed that a majority of Americans believed Captain Harrison's account and wanted congressional investigation. Editorial boards at major newspapers called for transparency and accountability. Perhaps most damaging was the steady stream of leaks from White House staff members who corroborated Harrison's claims. Anonymous sources confirmed details about canceled meetings, policy delays, and the toxic atmosphere that had developed in the West Wing. One particularly revealing leak came from a senior advisor who described a recent National Security Council meeting where Trump and Vance had openly disagreed about military strategy in front of foreign allies via video conference. "It was humiliating," the advisor told reporters on condition of anonymity. "Our allies didn't know where to look. They were witnessing the president and vice president of the United States essentially arguing like children while discussing life and death decisions." As the week progressed, it became clear that the Royal Guard revelations had fundamentally changed the political landscape. What had started as private disagreements between Trump and Vance had become a public crisis that threatened the stability of the entire administration. Both men would soon be forced to make decisions that would determine not only their own political futures, but the future of American democracy itself. The question was no longer whether their relationship could be repaired, but whether either of them could survive the storm that Captain Harrison's truth-telling had unleashed. The packed hearing room in the Capitol building had never seen anything quite like this. Every seat was filled with reporters, government officials, and concerned citizens who had somehow managed to get tickets to what was being called the most important congressional hearing in decades. Captain Michael Harrison sat at the witness table, looking composed despite the chaos swirling around him. To his left sat Agent Lisa Chen, and to his right was former Royal Guard operative James Mitchell, who had recently retired but agreed to testify about the unit's protocols and procedures. Committee Chairwoman Senator Patricia Williams called the hearing to order. "We are here today to examine allegations of serious dysfunction within the executive branch that may pose a threat to national security and the effective functioning of our government." The Republican members of the committee had initially opposed the hearing, but public pressure had forced their hand. Ranking Member Senator Robert Hayes made it clear in his opening statement that he viewed the proceedings with skepticism. "While we must take seriously any concerns about governmental function," Hayes said, "we must also be careful not to weaponize intelligence operations for political purposes." Captain Harrison was sworn in first. As he raised his right hand to take the oath, television cameras captured every detail of his expression. This was a man who had dedicated his career to serving his country in secret, now thrust into the most public spotlight imaginable. Senator Williams began with basic questions about the Royal Guard's mission and authority. Harrison explained how the unit was established in the aftermath of Watergate to monitor internal threats to governmental stability. Our mandate is quite specific, Harrison testified. We are authorized to observe and report on situations that could compromise the continuity of government operations. This includes monitoring the behavior and interactions of high-ranking officials. And what did your observations reveal about the relationship between President Trump and Vice President Vance? Williams asked. Harrison opened the thick folder in front of him. Over the course of 37 days, my team documented 43 instances of serious conflict between the president and vice president. These ranged from heated arguments to public contradictions to what can only be described as deliberate undermining of each other's authority. The hearing room buzzed with murmurs as Harrison described specific incidents. He testified about the Oval Office argument, the cabinet meeting confrontation, and numerous other examples of dysfunction. Senator Hayes, clearly uncomfortable with the testimony, pressed Harrison on his authority to conduct surveillance. Captain, isn't it true that you've been essentially spying on the president and vice president without their knowledge? Senator, our surveillance is conducted under legal authority established by congressional oversight, Harrison replied firmly. The Royal Guard operates within strict legal boundaries, and our activities are regularly reviewed by the appropriate committees. Agent Chen was called to testify next. Her account was even more detailed than Harrison's, including specific quotes from recorded conversations and descriptions of the impact the conflict was having on government operations. I witnessed Vice President Vance leave a national security briefing early because he said he couldn't be in the same room as the president, Chen testified. This briefing concerned potential terrorist threats to American cities. The delay in decision-making caused by this conflict put American lives at risk. The most dramatic moment came when former operative James Mitchell was asked about the constitutional implications of what the Royal Guard had observed. In my 20 years with the unit, I have never seen anything that approached this level of dysfunction, Mitchell said. The president and vice president have essentially stopped communicating, except when absolutely necessary. Policy decisions are being delayed or made unilaterally because they cannot work together. Senator Williams asked the question that everyone was thinking. In your professional opinion, does this situation constitute a threat to national security? Mitchell paused before answering. Yes, Senator. When the two highest-ranking officials in the executive branch cannot function as a team, it compromises our ability to respond to threats, conduct diplomacy, and maintain the confidence of our allies. During the lunch break, news leaked that both President Trump and Vice President Vance were watching the hearing from separate locations in the White House. Sources reported that Trump was furious about the testimony, while Vance was deeply concerned about the national security implications being discussed. The afternoon session focused on specific examples of how the conflict had affected government operations. Agent Chen presented a timeline showing how various policy initiatives had been delayed or derailed because of the Trump-Vance feud. On March 15th, a crucial trade negotiation with Japan was postponed because the president and vice president could not agree on the American position, Chen testified. Our trading partners were left waiting for 3 days while the two principals argued about tariff policy. What about military readiness? Asked Senator Martinez, a former military officer, herself. There have been at least 6 instances where military briefings were delayed or conducted separately for the president and vice president because they refused to attend the same meeting. Chen replied. The most shocking revelation came near the end of the day. Harrison testified that the Royal Guard had evidence of both Trump and Vance discussing the possibility of removing the other from office. We have recordings of President Trump asking his legal counsel about the process for removing a vice president, Harrison said. And we have similar recordings of Vice President Vance discussing the 25th Amendment with constitutional scholars. The hearing room erupted in shocked whispers. The 25th Amendment allows for the removal of a president who is unable to perform the duties of office. The fact that Vance had been researching it suggested he was considering whether Trump was unfit to serve. Senator Williams called for order. Captain Harrison, are you saying that both the president and vice president have been actively considering ways to remove each other from office? That is correct, Senator. Both men appear to view the other as a threat to effective governance. As the hearing concluded, it was clear that the Royal Guard testimony had fundamentally changed the political landscape. The evidence presented showed a level of dysfunction that went far beyond normal political disagreements. Senator Williams announced that the committee would be issuing a formal report within 1 week, and that additional hearings might be necessary. The testimony we have heard today raises serious questions about the ability of this administration to govern effectively, she said. As the hearing ended and the witnesses left the Capitol, everyone knew that the revelations had created a crisis that would require immediate action. The question was no longer whether Trump and Vance could repair their relationship, but whether either of them could survive the constitutional crisis that their conflict had created. The American people had heard the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. Now it was up to their elected representatives to decide what to do about it. The days following the congressional hearing felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. Washington buzzed with rumors, emergency meetings, and desperate attempts by party leaders to find a solution to the crisis that threatened to tear apart the government. President Trump spent most of his time in the Oval Office, refusing to take calls from congressional leaders and reportedly drafting multiple versions of a statement that would blame everyone except himself for the situation. His remaining loyal staff members walked on eggshells, knowing that any wrong word could trigger another explosive outburst. Vice President Vance, meanwhile, had effectively moved his operations out of the White House. He was working from his official residence, meeting with constitutional lawyers and quietly reaching out to cabinet members to gauge their loyalty. The 25th Amendment research that Captain Harrison had mentioned was no longer secret, and Vance was seriously considering whether he had enough support to invoke it. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when both men were scheduled to attend a joint press conference with visiting Canadian Prime Minister Sarah Thompson. It was supposed to be a routine diplomatic event, but everyone knew it would be the first time Trump and Vance had appeared together publicly since the Royal Guard revelations. Prime Minister Thompson arrived at the White House unaware that she was about to witness one of the most dramatic moments in American political history. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the Rose Garden, with dozens of international reporters in attendance. Trump arrived first, taking his position at the podium with his usual confidence, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders and the forced nature of his smile. When Vance appeared 2 minutes later, the atmosphere in the garden became electric with anticipation. The two men stood side by side but avoided making eye contact. Prime Minister Thompson began with remarks about the strong relationship between the United States and Canada, but everyone's attention was focused on the body language between Trump and Vance. When it came time for questions, the first reporter asked about trade policy. Trump began to answer, but Vance suddenly stepped forward to the microphone. "Actually, I disagree with the president's characterization of our trade position," Vance said clearly. The crowd of reporters sensed blood in the water. This was the public confrontation everyone had been expecting since the Royal Guard revelations. Trump's face turned red with anger. "Excuse me, but I'm the president here. I'll handle the questions about trade policy." "And I'm the vice president," Vance replied, turning to face Trump directly. The American people deserve to hear honest answers, not political spin. Prime Minister Thompson stood frozen between them, unsure whether to intervene or step away. The cameras captured every moment as the two most powerful men in America faced off in front of the world. "You've been undermining me from day one," Trump said, no longer caring about the cameras or the international audience. "I've been trying to save this administration from your reckless decisions," Vance shot back. The argument escalated quickly. Trump accused Vance of being a traitor and a power-hungry politician who was using the Royal Guard revelations to advance his own agenda. Vance accused Trump of being unfit for office and putting his own ego ahead of the country's interests. As the two men argued, something unprecedented happened. Members of the White House staff began choosing sides publicly. Chief of Staff Rebecca Walsh stepped forward and stood behind Vance. Defense Secretary Patricia Collins did the same. But Treasury Secretary James Morgan moved to stand behind Trump, along with several other cabinet members. The symbolism was unmistakable. The administration was literally splitting apart in real time on live television, in front of the entire world. The confrontation reached its climax when Vance pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket. Mr. President, I can no longer serve in this administration. I am hereby submitting my resignation as Vice President of the United States. Trump grabbed the document and tore it in half. You can't resign.
I'm firing you.
You can't fire a vice president, Vance replied calmly. But I can invoke the 25th Amendment if you're unable to perform your duties. The crowd of reporters erupted in shouting questions. Prime Minister Thompson finally stepped away from the podium, realizing that diplomatic protocol no longer applied to this situation. In that moment, as the two men continued to argue in front of the world, Captain Michael Harrison watched from the White House security office. He had done what he felt was necessary to protect American democracy. The truth was finally out in the open. Congressional leaders, watching the press conference from their offices, immediately began making phone calls. House Speaker Maria Rodriguez announced that she would be calling an emergency session of Congress. Senate Majority Leader David Kim said he was consulting with constitutional scholars about the unprecedented situation. Within hours, Vance had officially submitted his resignation to Congress, citing irreconcilable differences with the president and concerns about the administration's ability to govern effectively. Trump, meanwhile, held his own press conference denouncing Vance as a disloyal fraud and announcing that he would nominate a new vice president within days. But the damage was done. The Royal Guard revelations, followed by the very public breakdown of the Trump-Vance partnership, had shaken American democracy to its core. Foreign allies questioned America's stability. Financial markets plunged as investors worried about political chaos. In the end, Captain Harrison's decision to speak out had accomplished exactly what he intended. The American people finally knew the truth about what was happening in their government. They had seen with their own eyes the dysfunction that threatened their democracy. The political fallout would continue for months, with congressional investigations, legal challenges, and calls for both impeachment and invocation of the 25th Amendment. But the moment when Trump and Vance publicly destroyed their partnership in front of the world would be remembered as the day when the Royal Guard's revelations finally forced the truth into the open. Captain Harrison had kept his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. The American people now had the information they needed to make decisions about their government. Democracy had been tested, but it had survived because someone was willing to tell the truth, no matter the personal cost.